In the waning days of his reign, Emperor Theodosius I faced a decision that would echo through centuries. The great Library of Alexandria, already scarred by fire and siege, stood vulnerable beneath the weight of a changing empire. Rather than ordering its demolition, a fate that befell countless pagan sites, Theodosius issued an edict to preserve it as a sanctuary of learning for the Christian world he was shaping. Scholars were summoned from across the empire. The custodians of the scrolls swore oaths of protection. In that single act, the fragile bridge between antiquity and the medieval age was secured. The library emerged from its crisis not as a relic, but as a living institution. The newly formed Alexandrian Scholars Guild, composed of Greek philosophers, Egyptian scribes, and Roman administrators, took charge of cataloguing, translating, and copying every work that entered their halls. Under the watchful eye of the Byzantine Imperial Academy, which sent emissaries to ensure imperial oversight, the Guild began a systematic program. Each classical text was transcribed onto parchment, annotated with marginal notes from contemporary thinkers, and stored in climate-controlled chambers, a rudimentary but effective preservation method. This continuity meant that Euclid's Elements, Archimedes' treatises on levers, and Ptolemy's astronomical tables were not lost to the ravages of time. Instead, they circulated among scholars in Constantinople, Antioch, and even distant Gaul. The flow of knowledge was no longer a one-way transmission from antiquity to the Islamic world. It became a two-way dialogue that kept ancient science vibrant throughout the Roman world's twilight. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become the empire's official faith. Yet the Church faced a dilemma: how to reconcile its doctrinal authority with the wealth of pagan learning now housed safely in Alexandria. In 426 CE, Pope Celestine convened what would be known as the Papal Synod of Knowledge in Rome. Delegates from the Alexandrian Scholars Guild traveled west, bearing copies of Aristotle's Physics and Galen's Medical Compendia. The Synod did not condemn these works outright. Instead, it established a framework for their study. Classical texts could be examined so long as they were interpreted through a Christian moral lens. This compromise was codified in the Decree of Harmonious Inquiry, which encouraged monasteries to maintain scriptoria that copied both biblical and secular works side by side. The result was an unprecedented synthesis. Monks became not only copyists of scripture, but also custodians of Euclidean geometry and Hippocratic medicine. As the Western Roman structures crumbled, feudalism rose to fill the power vacuum. Lords built castles, vassals swore oaths, and serfs tilled the land. Yet even in these fragmented polities, the influence of Alexandria seeped through. The guild sent itinerant scholars, often monks trained at monastic schools, to the courts of Frankish and Anglo-Saxon lords. These envoys introduced practical applications of ancient engineering, water-wheel designs that could power grain mills year-round, and early concepts of hydraulic lifting. One such exchange occurred in 540 CE, when a Burgundian count commissioned an Alexandrian engineer to redesign his castle's drawbridge using Archimedean principles. The result was a mechanism that required far less manpower and could be operated swiftly during raids. News of this success traveled along trade routes, prompting other lords to adopt similar technologies. Thus, feudal societies began integrating empirical knowledge into their infrastructure, laying groundwork for later mechanization. When the mid-14th century brought the Black Death, Europe was already equipped with a more sophisticated medical corpus than in our timeline. Physicians trained in monastic schools consulted Galen's humoral theory alongside Hippocratic observations of contagion, knowledge preserved and expanded upon by Alexandrian scholars over centuries. While mortality remained devastating, the combination of empirical observation and classical doctrine allowed for earlier public health measures. Quarantine of ports, systematic burial practices, and rudimentary epidemiological tracking. Cities such as Venice, which maintained a close partnership with the Guild's maritime division, instituted shipboard isolation protocols based on ancient Greek understandings of disease spread. Though these actions could not halt the pandemic, they reduced its severity in certain hubs and demonstrated the practical value of preserved ancient science when faced with crisis. The invention of movable type by Gutenberg in 1440 is a cornerstone of our history. In this divergent world, the presence of a vast, organized corpus of classical texts accelerated the diffusion of printing technology. By the early 15th century, Alexandrian scribes had already experimented with wooden blocks for reproducing diagrams and tables. When German craftsmen introduced metal type, the Guild's scholars recognized its potential not merely for scripture, but for transmitting Euclidean proofs, astronomical charts, and engineering schematics. In 1452 CE, a collaborative workshop in Alexandria printed a compendium titled De Mechanica Antiqua, containing detailed illustrations of gear ratios and water lift systems derived from Archimedes. The work reached the courts of Milan and Prague within months, sparking interest among artisans who began to apply these principles to clockmaking and textile machinery. The spread of technical manuals preceded the broader humanist movement, creating a feedback loop where practical innovation fueled intellectual curiosity. By the early 16th century, Europe's scientific landscape resembled what we would call the Enlightenment, but it arrived a full century earlier. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Constantinople incorporated Alexandrian texts into their curricula alongside scholastic philosophy. The presence of accurate astronomical data, refined through centuries of observation at the library's observatory, provided a solid empirical foundation for challenging Ptolemaic geocentrism. In 1523 CE, an Italian mathematician named Leonardo di Cavour published De Nova Astronomia, arguing for heliocentric motion based on precise planetary tables preserved from Hipparchus and refined by Alexandrian astronomers. His arguments were not dismissed as heretical because the Papal Synod of Knowledge had already established a precedent for evaluating scientific claims within a theological framework that permitted natural explanations of God's creation. The ripple effect was swift. Engineers began constructing more efficient windmills, utilizing aerodynamic principles described in ancient Greek treatises on fluid dynamics. Chemists, building upon alchemical texts that the Guild had catalogued, isolated acids with greater purity, leading to advances in metallurgy and glassmaking. The industrial capacity of Europe expanded, and by 1580 CE, the continent boasted mechanized textile workshops, comparable to those that would appear in our timeline only 2 centuries later. The prolonged coexistence of Christian doctrine and classical learning reshaped the Church's self-understanding. Rather than viewing pagan philosophy as a threat, many clerics embraced it as a tool for elucidating divine order. The Council of Nicaea II, convened in 1591 CE, issued a declaration that the study of nature is a reverent act, for through understanding the world, we honor its creator. This theological stance legitimized scientific inquiry and encouraged clergy to sponsor laboratories attached to cathedrals. Monastic orders, such as the Benedictine scholars, began operating observatories and experimental gardens. Their reports were sent to Rome, where they informed papal policies on education and health. The Church's patronage of science created a cultural climate in which innovation was not merely tolerated, but celebrated as an expression of faith. Conflicts that in our history erupted into violent suppression, such as the trial of Galileo, were mitigated by centuries of institutional precedent for dialogue. The survival of the Library of Alexandria set in motion a cascade of cause and effect that altered the tempo of human progress. By safeguarding ancient texts, Theodosius I inadvertently forged a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world, a bridge that allowed knowledge to flow uninterrupted across empires, religions, and social orders. Feudal lords adopted engineering solutions, pandemics met with early public health measures, printing accelerated the dissemination of technical know-how. A scientific revolution ignited centuries before it did in our own timeline. Yet this narrative is not a celebration of unmitigated triumph. The intertwining of faith and reason produced its own tensions, demanding constant negotiation between doctrinal authority and empirical evidence. Societies still wrestled with the distribution of power, the ethics of new technologies, and the responsibility that accompanies knowledge. The library's endurance reminded humanity that preservation is a choice, a deliberate act to honor the past while shaping the future. In the quiet halls of Alexandria today, parchment whispers under the soft glow of oil lamps. Scholars trace the lines of Euclid, contemplate the heavens through Ptolemy's lenses, and write new equations that will guide ships across oceans yet uncharted. Their work is a testament to a single imperial decree made over 15 centuries ago, a moment when mercy outweighed destruction and the world was forever altered.